Let's look at our preferences in Review and make sure that they're all squared away. We can find them by going to the Review dropdown and then clicking on Preferences. Let's start with the General category and then the Options tab at the top. Here is where the dreaded theme can be changed. And if you remember this tutorial that I made in 2019, which is very similar to this one, I was using the light theme. And as a popular request and as a personal request to myself as the years have progressed, I've realized that the dark theme is actually a lot easier to see the icons in. So I'll be using the dark theme exclusively from now on. The light theme, of course, looks like this. And so when I switch to it, let's click OK and let's see how that looks. Oh, this brings back memories, doesn't it? So let's switch out of this theme because the icons are a little bit harder to see and the screen is about 10 times brighter than it was. So let's go back to the dark theme and click OK. And that's how you can change a single setting to make sure that your testing settings, you'll have to click OK in that dialog. So let's go back to Review and then Preferences. And now let's look at the document dropdown. Actually, before we do, we'll continue in the options dropdown. There isn't anything too major that you should change here. However, you can toggle your full screen crosshair here. Now, there is a toggle for it in the view dropdown. However, this turns it on permanently, and you can still toggle it off if you need to in the view dropdown. I don't like to personally use it because it takes up the entire screen and you can't really control the crosshair size like you can in some CAD and BIM programs, but it can be useful if you want it. We can also look down here and see this very interesting option, Open Home Page in Web tab on Startup. This essentially means that you can use Review as a web browser. It will open Review slightly slower if you have this turned on every single time you open the program. So I recommend that you instead go to the Window dropdown and open a web tab if you want to within the program itself. Now, you can also check and uncheck this option here. You'll see this option to help Review or to help Bluebeam improve their products and services by automatically sending them your usage data. And you'll see that when you first install the program. If you skipped over it and you want to turn it on or off, you can toggle it right here as well. Now, let's move on. And actually, one more time before I do move on, I forgot that there is something quite useful here. Your user is right here. Now, this user can be changed, and this will automatically change the author of specific markups. So if I go to Properties and I click on a markup here, you'll see that my author right now is actually picking up on the author from my computer. I created this markup before I changed my name over there. So if I was to create a brand new markup, for example, you can see immediately, I haven't even made the markup yet, it says that my author is my full name because I changed that a few months ago. So there it is. Now all default markups will be created with this author, and this is great for categorizing your markups, and then you can assign certain markups to other authors, for example. So we'll go back to Review and Preferences, and yes, I recommend that you change this user if your computer's username is not to your specifications. Now let's go to the document area. There also aren't too many options we need to change here. However, when you're looking at certain page layouts, you can change these options. Now, usually these are fine. However, there is something here that I will recommend. The page layout by default will automatically detect and change according to the page size. Now, if you want to use a certain kind of page layout, which I'm going to go over in this tutorial very soon, then you can choose either of them here. I actually prefer to use the one full page option, which I believe is called continuous if I'm not mistaken. And this basically allows me to zoom in and out of my drawings instead of scrolling down or up with my mouse wheel. So single page will allow you to scroll down or up, I believe. These are named slightly different from the toggle options down here. So we can test this later, but for now, let's leave this as is because it is good that Review is automatically detecting our page size, and it does show our page size down here in the bottom right. Also, it shows it once again in the status bar. Moving on, we can then look at our zoom. The maximum zoom size is actually a setting that we should change because there are some instances where I need to zoom very, very intricately and carefully on something, and Review actually stops me at 7,000%. Now, can we go higher? Oh, yes, we can. I've actually never tried to change this before, so it's a good thing I'm making this tutorial. So Let's set that to 10,000. This might affect our rendering slightly, but I don't think it will if we're not zooming in that far, and there are some instances in which this could be useful. It looks like we can actually go beyond 10,000, but I think that should be enough for my personal needs. Now we have some other settings here. You don't have to worry too much about them, but you can look at them and test them as you go. Navigation is a really important tab up here. So in navigation, the most important thing that I like to change is the sensitivity. By default, the sensitivity is set to 4. This means that whenever you roll your mouse wheel forward or back, you're going to roll roughly 4 lines, so to speak. The unit is very vague in this instance, but you're going to roll forward that amount of lines, so to speak. Now, I like to center certain parts of a screen, and sometimes when I roll forward or back, it zooms in too much and zooms out too much. So there are some instances where I'd rather zoom in a lot less. So I've changed my sensitivity from 4 to 2. If you're trying this out for your first time, I recommend that you try out 3. And if that is still too drastic, you can also change it to 2 like I have. Changing it to 1 might be way too drastic because that means that you'll have to roll your mouse wheel more in order to get to the same location compared to just having the sensitivity set to 2 or 3, for example. Then you can also enable your horizontal scroll bar. I don't need it, but it is pretty cool. It allows a similar scroll bar to the vertical one right here to be at the bottom of your screen. It takes up a little bit of viewing space, so I leave it turned off on my end. And the synchronization mode by default can be enabled here. Synchronized views can also be turned on almost permanently here. The toggle for that is in our status bar. So the synchronization mode for synchronized page and document, we'll go into that a little bit later in this tutorial, but you can set the defaults basically in your preferences. So you'll see that there's going to be a lot of similarities to settings and preferences and different functions that we'll look at in the program. Let's move on to grid and snap. These are all of our grid and snap functions in the program. Once we turn on our grid, which is this button right here, and once we turn snap to grid, which is right here, and you'll see show grid and snap grid, those same functions are right here as well, you can essentially modify your grid spacing. And that way you can really use the grid effectively, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to leave all these settings as default for now. Funnily enough, the grid and snap category also shows many different functions that we've seen that we will see, in the status bar down here, such as snap to content and snap to markup. Now, whatever is currently turned on or off is also turned on or off in preferences. But if we turn it on in preferences, it will stay turned on when we close and open the program. So snap to markup I usually keep off most of the time. There are some instances where it's useful to snap markups to each other, or to align markups to each other in relation to one another. And snap to content is very useful, so I recommend that you keep that one turned on. You can also see the individual snaps, which can be toggled on or off here. So certain objects such as lines and curves can be snapped to or not if you want to exclude certain ones. You can also make sure that you're snapping to midpoints, endpoints, intersections, even page boundaries. And you have this option to ignore tiny line segments, which is quite interesting. This actually might be a good or a bad thing, and I'm going to turn it off because this is the first time that I'm really looking at this option right here. I believe that this might be interfering with snapping to certain intersections, and if there were extra lines that were made in CAD or BIM programs and then converted to a PDF, they may be ignored. So I'm actually going to leave that off and see if it affects my snapping, and we'll test that out in this tutorial very soon. Then our sensitivity actually has a toggle right here, and we can see the color for our snap. It's going to be a blank box with a black border, and it'll turn blue once we actually snap to a midpoint or endpoint or intersection, for example. So we can change that color. I'm actually going to change it from the default now because I think that'll be quite useful. And I'm going to try something that should be relatively visible. I think that a green color should be good. I'm actually going to use this arrow right here and choose a green that's in between the light and the dark green. So I'm actually just going to click right here, and then I'm going to use this slider. Let's make it just slightly darker. We can see the actual color changing down here. And this green right here looks just about right. So we'll leave it like that. Perfect. So now our snap color has changed. We'll test that out and see if we like it. And the sensitivity is set to 10. I believe if I set that sensitivity to a lower number, that would mean that we would snap more often, if I'm not mistaken. Let's test that theory because I think this is going to help with some troubleshooting that I was having with certain documents that were created by external clients for my clients. and they were having issues snapping to certain lines and certain intersections. This might fix the issue. So I'm glad we went here together. Let's look at the last category under General, which is spelling. This is very useful. I recently made a tutorial on the autocomplete entries and how we manage them. So once again, we can manage them here. I'm not going to go into it here because it's already been covered. We can also turn spell check on or off. It might not be necessary if you're putting a lot of different labels and words that are not necessarily used in common English vernacular, for example. And we can include or exclude uppercase words in that. So usually I like to keep spell check on, and uppercase words are excluded from being spell checked, so to speak. That way, labels that are usually in all caps can be excluded from it, and we won't see that red underline underneath our words there. Then we can also add certain words to our custom words library. For example, I typically am working with programs that are made by Autodesk, so I sometimes put that word in writing sometimes. So it was actually being detected as an incorrect word, and I made sure to add it to my custom words. I can add more words by clicking on the plus sign right here, and I can literally type the word and then click OK, and it's done. So my last name is a rather strange one. It has a J and a T next to it, which is very uncommon. So we'll just click OK right here, and I think that is nice to have in our custom words library. Let's look at more preferences. Let's move on to the interface category. We don't have too many settings that we need to change here, but I'll explain a few important ones. For example, we can choose how many files will be in our recent files list, and the default is set to 20, which means that when we look at a 21st file, the first one, the oldest file in that list, will be replaced by the 21st file. Now, this could be bad if you're cycling through a lot of different files all day long and you want to be able to look at all of the old files and not have to forget which one you looked at a few hours ago. So we can increase this from 20 to 25 or even higher if we wanted to. Then files in our recent list will actually disappear after 90 days by default. So we can change that to 120 days to give them a little bit more time to stay in that recent list. Then we can go to this markup list settings. Most of the settings here are fine as they are, but there's two that are very interesting. The first one is zoom fit markups when selected. This is actually extremely useful, and I'm going to check this on because now when a markup is selected, it's going to essentially be zoomed in on my screen, and I'll know exactly which markup I'm dealing with. Now, sometimes you do want to maintain a fixed zoom increment while selecting markups, so this could get a little cumbersome and it could get a bit annoying, but I think that you'll all like this setting, and you can always turn it off if you don't. Then we can look at this filtered annotation dim percent. This basically means that if a markup is filtered in our markups list, then it's going to be 40% transparent. So we can always change that if we need to as well. Let's go to layers here. We don't have to worry too much about this, but if we have child layers that are basically connected to parent layers, and we hide the parent layer, then the child layer will hide as well. This is the intended method of dealing with child layers, so we leave this basically checked on. If you do want child layers to not be hidden if a parent layer is hidden, which kind of defeats the purpose, then you can uncheck this if you want to. And if you want your layers to only show on your page and not be global layers that are basically connected throughout the document, then you could also check show layers on page only. Then let's go to tools right here. There's a few settings that we do want to turn on here. The most important ones are reuse markup tools, which you can also toggle on or off in your status bar right down here, and auto size text box and call out markups. These two settings are extremely useful. They're going to save you a lot of time. And reuse tools only requires you to learn how to use the escape key instead of Revu automatically deselecting a markup when you're done creating one. I'll demonstrate that very soon when we're done with preferences. Now, moving on, let's look at a few more settings here. Most of these settings we can leave as they are. Nothing here that's too crazy to look at. Let's go to measure here. These aren't really measure settings. They're actually settings for a tool called Dynamic Fill. So these are all the settings for it. And I've already changed my settings here, so you can see what I've changed them to. I've increased the DPI from 300 to 400, the maximum amount. This makes our fills a bit more accurate, and it usually works on more powerful computers, but most PCs can handle 400 dots per inch. Then we can increase our fill size, make sure that it's around 50%. If we're filling in a very small area, we can decrease that. And all of these settings can be changed while doing a fill, but these are the settings that will basically be sticking and will be permanent whenever you close and open the program. Then I've increased my fill speed to 30%. I've left the colors at the default colors because they're pretty easy to see. And I've set my boundary size as small as possible. Sadly, it can't go lower than 25%, but this should still allow you to essentially create boundaries. Then we can go to our edge sensitivity, and it should be set to high. The low sensitivity allows the fill to pass through lines too easily, I find. So usually the high sensitivity is more preferable. Then we can go to sketch. There aren't really too many settings here, and we can leave them as they are. And this essentially will change what kind of rotation and ellipse input we want, and you can test these out and see which one you prefer. Then under forms, we also don't have too many settings to change here, but we can look at the highlight opacity. While actually highlighting something, our cursor is going to allow us to see through it. And then when the highlight is done, by default, we can still see the text below it. That means that the highlight's opacity is only at 25%, not at 100%, like drawing a regular line, for example. So this is quite useful. And then we can move on to signature. And these settings here are just for how long we can stay online or logged in when we sign in and try to use signatures. So our password will automatically time out within 5 minutes by default. We can increase that if we're signing a lot and we don't want to have to type in our password every single time. And as long as you leave the program open usually, this timer is not counting down. I believe this starts to count down when you close the program, if I'm not mistaken. Then we can change where our digital ID is located by default, along with our trusted identity location. By default, it's located within Bluebeam's folder on our computers, and you can always change that if you want to. I just like to export my digital ID to a place in my documents folder so that I have a copy of it, and then I can put it on my network and share it with some colleagues if I need to through email. And then basically these are the settings here that we need to worry about. Everything looks pretty good here. We can then move on to Studio. And there aren't too many things to worry about here, but let's look at some settings here. For example, when we get an alert in Studio, it is useful to see the orange flashing effect, but if we don't want to see it, we can always uncheck that. So that setting is here. Under servers, this is the most important part. We can actually see that there's a display name area here. Now, you don't see that, and I can't click inside of it yet because I have to sign in. What I'm going to do is I am going to quickly sign in, because I want you guys to see how easy it is to change your display name. A lot of people try to use their email whenever they set their display name. So instead, you can basically change it to your first and your last name, which is what I recommend to all my students so that people can identify you easily when you're inside of the session. So instead of seeing A. Rejtman and assuming that my last name is starting at the R with Rejtman, I would put Ari Rejtman. So I'm just going to type in my password right here. I believe that is a variation. Oh, I think it is another variation. Let's try this one. There we are. So now that I've signed in, the display name, yep, it should load right there, and there's my display name, and I can change it here whenever I want to, and then click OK in my settings. Now let's look at Window, and let's see what settings we need to change here. Here in the Window category, we have some settings for a tablet. If you're using Bluebeam Revu on a tablet that has Windows 10 on it, then most of the settings that you'll see here will basically be the same, if not all of them. So these settings here can help you to navigate more easily. For example, you can enable your tablet's zoom feature. Depending on what kind of tablet you have, this will be a little bit different, depending on the cursor or the stylus that you're using. And we have some options here that are quite interesting, including enabling text highlighting. That means that any vector data text, you can actually click and hold with the highlight tool activated and drag a highlight perfectly on top of it with your stylus. Now, this could get a little cumbersome or in the way of freeform highlights, so you can enable or disable this whenever you need to. Now, we're not going to look at all the settings here. Let's move on to presentation. You can essentially give a little presentation view of Revu, and it's quite useful. So after you cycle through the last page of your presentation, you can allow it to loop if you want to, or you can allow the presentation to end. So it depends on the kind of presentation that you're trying to create. You can allow it to automatically advance, and we can set that interval from the default of 5 seconds to a higher interval of, for example, 10 seconds. Then we can also look at our page transition, and we can change between many different kinds, some of which you'll be familiar with if you've used PowerPoint, for example. So we can always change that if we'd like to. A nice little fade usually looks pretty good, so I'm actually going to switch mine to fade if I use this in the future. We can also change the direction of certain transitions. So I believe a wipe transition is one of those. Yes, it is. Now I can change the direction in which my page will wipe or swipe, so to speak, down, left, right, diagonally. It's quite interesting. I'm going to set mine back to fade. And we can have a background color behind our PDF while we're giving a presentation. So by default, that's black. That allows us to see the document that we're looking at and allow it to stand out a bit more. But you can choose contrasting colors from here if you'd like to. And you can allow your mouse cursor to automatically hide after a bit of a delay. You can have your mouse cursor always hidden. That could be useful in certain circumstances. Or if you're giving an interactive presentation, you can have it so that it's always visible and doesn't disappear. So these settings are really, really useful and very, very cool when it comes to using Revu as a presentation software. Let's look at the last tab up here for Web tab. And this is quite interesting because you can use Revu as a web browser. And so I think I already demonstrated that earlier when we went into Generals settings. And you can go to Window and actually just open up a web tab whenever you want to. So the settings here are very good. You can allow your graphic processing unit to essentially use acceleration, so that should load things a bit faster. It might take more processing power from your computer, but most computers can handle it. And the other settings here aren't too crucial. You can always experiment with them based on your preferences. Let's look at our next category for sets. And this one we're actually going to skip over completely because we can look at this category and all of these settings for sets for the actual tutorial for sets. But just so you know, you have many different kinds of options to change how your sets work. For example, you can change how edited documents or edited sets are opened, either in a new tab or a new tab in front, for example. Under the sorting area, for example, you can change your sorting order. So some of these settings are pretty self-explanatory. You can ignore numbers if you just want to do alphabetic instead of alphanumeric, for example. So we're not going to worry too much about the settings right now. Under import and export, this is where we can manage some of the plugins that are found in other programs like Microsoft's Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Before we get to them, under options, the text content recovery can process scanned content only, or we can include all content if we want to. I'm actually going to change that just in case. I haven't had to use this yet, but if I do need to process content, perhaps all content might give me more of the information that I need. It might take longer as a result, so we'll have to do some testing on that, depending on the files that we're trying to recover. Then under Word, when we're opening a file that basically came from Word, we have different kinds of settings here that we can look into a little bit later. Our headers and footers, for example, they can be retained, so we can leave them as is, or we can allow headers and footers to be imported essentially as actual text. So that could be useful, but I think retaining headers and footers will be even more useful because we can manage our headers and footers in Revu as well. Then we have some settings for Excel as well. We're not going to get too detailed into these, but essentially you can modify some settings here. PowerPoint only has one setting, so we can essentially detect lists and tables from PowerPoint if we need to. And images, we have many different settings here for importing and exporting images. We can set our default resolution, video resolution to whatever we need to, and you can change these settings as per your workflow. Now let's move on to advanced, and this is very important because the advanced tab allows us to fix some bugs that may occur depending on your graphics card and your computer's processing power. So the rendering engine here is usually set to hardware by default, but sometimes Revu detects your computer's specifications and sets it to software. Software is used if your hardware is not powerful enough, but it could be a little bit slower. Hardware is typically faster, but it does use more of your computer's hardware in order to process Revu. I don't recommend using legacy unless you have a very old computer and if you're using very light PDFs. Then the other setting that can really help is the rendering mode. This basically means that as you're navigating through Review and making some changes, Review is going to automatically start changing and refreshing information in order for you to essentially not see too many blurry details as you're navigating. However, if your computer is running a bit slow while doing this and you are dealing with a very heavy PDF, the option to wait for completion is extremely useful. This allows us to essentially only refresh what is currently visible on our screen, and then when we navigate to another part of our screen, you'll see that the screen itself will be very blurry for a little bit longer, but it will process eventually, and this can make navigating a lot faster in Review. I don't need to change it for myself, but I do recommend it for people that have slightly less powerful computers. Then we have other settings here, such as disabling line weights. This is a setting that you can toggle as well. So the setting here can be found with this button here, which is found in our navigation bar. So we go to Tools and Toolbars and then Navigation in order to find this button and make sure that it's on. I like to keep it on most of the time because it allows me to snap to my lines a lot easier. And you'll notice that as I zoom in on lines, the lines are essentially very thin. We'll show that very soon when we get into the actual navigation of Review. Then we can continue on. We have some 3D rendering options. I haven't changed these yet. This mostly has to do with 3D PDFs, so you can change some settings here if you need to. JavaScript settings are here. JavaScript is great in Review because you can have custom stamps. You can start to automate certain functions in Review. So you can always work with that if you know how to. And then archiving PDFs. This is essentially a new file type or a different kind of file type called a PDF/A. So there's a few options here. And when you open one of these, they are usually files that can't be modified because that's the difference between a PDF and a PDF archive. They're essentially locked. And you can allow these PDFs to remain locked when you open them or not. Sometimes you need to convert them. You don't need to open them as unlocked. You can actually just do a save as and make sure that you change the file extension at the end. So there's many ways to deal with them. And you can change some settings here if you need to. Now let's look at the last category right here for admin. This is a very important category as well because here is where we can reset our program if we're experiencing bugs. Now, if you're ever experiencing a bug in Review, or if you want to reset to factory settings, you have a few options. I recommend that you export your profile and your tools first, and then you can click on Backup as well. Now, the problem with Backup is that you'll probably have the error or the bug in the backup as well, because the backup is going to back up your profile, your tools, and other settings in the program, and it basically has a lot of different files that are locked up in this zip file, basically, that it creates. So you can back up your program if you're not having any issues. It's a great way to essentially restore any settings that you want, and it combines your profile and tools and other settings like I mentioned. And you can restore your backup with this button here. And when you're ready, you can reset to factory default settings right here. And that's basically our preferences in a nutshell. Now that we're finished with our settings, we can click on OK, and all of our changes will be saved. So our preferences are complete, and now we can look at how we can navigate Review more effectively. This is the end of the second part of our series on the interface and navigation of Bluebeam Revu 20. The next part is going to cover the navigation of Review.